only live stream today. And I got to the point where I have been eating so many carbs and I'm so bloated up on water retention, sodium, and gratefully all the calories that I could muster, right? And protein, that all I had this morning, upon waking anyway, was a scoop of protein powder. In that, I just needed to step away from the high carbohydrate, high caloric, 37 to like 4,200 calories per day. There's a point where you just can't stuff your face anymore, right? This is an issue that many strength athletes deal with because there's a natural rhythm, right, with our chronobiology, with our HPTA, right, our hypothalamic-pituitary-testicular axis, where the hypothalamus signals the pituitary gland to release excretions, hormone excretions, to level out the behaviorism that's heavily correlated with like the blood-brain barrier, right? And there's a certain signal response that takes place. And I talk about this at times, mimetic sequencing, where this is how peptides work, is they send off the first chain where the body assumes that it's already releasing a certain agent, a secretion, like human growth hormone, right? Then it says, let's release more of that. So really, is this a lie? Are we tricking the ontology? Like, is this what it means to, there's been books written on this where you trick the devil, so to speak, or you convince the ontology and you become more, you think you're tricking the ontology, you think you're tricking the devil, but in truth, what's happening is you're showing that you've already converted, right? That's not how human beings think. They think, oh, I got away with it, I'm more powerful than you. And it's like, no, you're one of us. In other words, you think like us and you proved it, and now you can't take it back, right? You're deceptive, and we want you to admit that to survive you have to be deceptive. So it gets into Pan, right? The pantheon of gods, right? It gets into Pan. You have this half beast, right? This hooved character playing the flute and tied in with nature, and becomes the moniker for really Cain, Ophite worship, and this tie-in of what a man is when he's being true to himself, that he's going to need to show his, and this is the sick part of the Bible, right? It's the fact that, well, you could, if you were not just goyim or the profane, you could just eat this sort of matrix amino acid paste and probably get even healthier. But we're going to keep you trapped in this economic disparaging cycle where you have to kill and eat cows in order to get beef liver. We'll make it affordable for you, but there's really nothing else that you could eat that's that nutritious when you start to feel off and you've pushed it so far. And whereas if you choose the secular aspect of science, you're going to have to think like a scientist in order to get those rewards. So there's this gullibility where people really truly believe that they have all offerings available to them on the table, like this egalitarian democratic mind state or state of the union, quite literally. A unified state, a collective, where it doesn't mean that you and I think alike. It means that we'll take on the straw man as well as follow the campaign in a sort of, not necessarily a deceptive clandestine way, but that you have on the rise, people joining the Satanic Church who are, you know, sort of rifling back against the fundamentalist hypocrisy, right? That it's, but the irony is that they were Satanists all along. When you really get into the Bible and you really adhere to the Old Testament, the God of the Old Testament, and you begin to look at the Talmud, when you begin to look at the Kabbalistic aspects that come from the progenitor, which is the Jewish rabbis writing in this doctrine that's being delivered to them through this mind-blowing gematria, to understand the numerology, the geometrical codes being delivered to them. That, okay, you want to backward engineer from a secular sense, a scientific sense, through the lens, thinking that you can compartmentalize science and remove it from everything. Well, you're looking at the nature. You want to look under the dress and finery, as Friedrich Nietzsche says. Supposing truth is a woman. Well, the truth is that when you look at the engineering of the modern day female, Lilith, Eve, right? When you look at what's said in the Bible as I'm going to remake man in my image, we're talking about an ugly ass witch, a spider witch. We're talking about the ovum. We're talking about something that will be made to hail the image of, in other words, the geometrical reigning 5 points right on our hands, put right out in front of us, that this is the inverted pentagram. And when you see, oh, that's just a happy star from Carl's Jr., but Carl Karcher was a high-level Mason. When you look at the star as this signet or signature, oh, it's different when you have a double ring around it or a single ring. No, you're just admitting and binding to it, and you're saying, I recognize this because I'm a higher level thinker. But in fact, it's a tier system, a militia, an army, a pecking order. Don't you see? So it means that you're going to look at the inverted world as if it's right side up. In fact, you're following a campaign where you're convincing other people that this is a happy star. This is a good omen. But when you flip it upside down and you see it as an altar and it starts to take on that shape or that geometrical form, right? To the point where you're double ringing that thing and you're realizing that you have the Gauss sequence, 101 on the way up, 101 on the way down. A signet or a loop to the left, the signet back to the right. You're taking that energy off to the left-hand path, the carnal path. You're looping it right back out into the right of the ontology of what human beings, modern man. Don't you understand how they trick us? So to say this is man, that's to blame men for this shit, right? It's like, no, this is womb man. This isn't a man's world. This is woman's world. Do you understand that? The man with a womb. The man where if you turn that dial up or down, throw a little Lupron in there, or maybe enhance it with a little testosterone, right? Exogenous testosterone. Now you got a woman with a 4 or 5 inch clitoris. I've seen these chicks on steroids. I've heard their voices. I've been up close to them, okay? There's nothing feminine about them. You understand that? And so this gets us to the point. Is if me in my nature is not good enough and I don't meet this sort of Fibonacci golden mean phi proportion, but I take measures from the existential, well, like let's say tribal systems that hang a rock from their penises, from their phallus, right? To grow them out, right? Ones that actually integrate in to the very armor that they wear when they go hunting. I've seen depictions and documentaries of tribes that actually wear these things where their phalluses go into them, right? Into these systems, stretch them out, but then they're also wearing this thing that makes their phallus appear large. That they're really are hailing back to this Illuminati or this Masonic depiction of the monolith, right? And this gets into, all of the occulted geometrical practices. When you look at, the Pentagon, Capitol Hill, oh, they knew all this shit. They knew all this shit from the beginning. They knew to build up a society, to build up a culture, is to embrace this ophite serpent worship, to not just say, oh, this is the snake depicted as eating its tail, the Ouroboros, the samsara, but to take it into practice and political practice, policy, procedure, police, right? Polemics, and to say that all these physical characteristics, all these existential outcomes are in fact evil. We know it. We're saying it. We're putting it in our modern culture, in the symbolism, in the architecture, in the religions. But for those who have eyes to see, will they continue to go on in this way? In other words, they came to the point where they go, there's nothing better. To the point where you have Mormonism, Joseph Smith, right? Senior, junior, they're Masons. They're not just porch Masons. You get into Kristen Rosenkreutz, right? Rosicrucianism, they're Masons. You get into George Washington at 20 years old, a Mason. Actually, within like something like a 24-hour period, he was leveled up to a master Mason. Just boom, just like that, right? So it was like J.J. Vance on Operation GCD makes this point. It's like there's no way he studied for that and passed that in that period of time. No, they advanced him. Just like with Manly P. Hall. If he was doing, quote unquote, God's work, he wouldn't have been given the Master Mason. I think he was like considered a 33rd degree Mason or something. I think it was like a 32nd degree, and then who knows, maybe he went in and got that other degree. But there's this entire invisible, like when they talk about the invisible college, Rudolf Steiner gets into this, where he discusses at length the an invisible aspect to this higher level masonry that he has seen that possibly goes into the 94 to through like 98th degrees of Freemasonry, where they just knew it. They put themselves through they saw that the world itself was a Masonic jungle. They put together that this is a machine, right, on their own, without having to go through any Masonic rituals or traditions. That they had already reached this high level status, according to, from an existential sense. But really, is it existential when the Masons operationally are given the information of who is the purveyors, if they choose to be, or who has this sort of quote unquote gift in their eyes, right? Where they see the ontological entrapment around them, that the from the Masonic Hall to the public library to the theater to the school systems, when you look at the shape of this, of each and every town, you're looking at a motherboard or a grid system. And even more so, you see it from another view. You're seeing these Lie lines, right? And this torsion field energy that's carried through that the pyramids exemplify. That this is going to be a resonance according to this sphere of phi balance, with pi inferred and built into it. And this resonant aspect to the precession of the stars, where it's locking in. So you get into the eschatology of, well, whoever breaks this cycle, whoever says, I'm not going to be the one who's shit on here, I'm an individual, this is wrong. And then by you standing up, that person becomes, they're considered like the Antichrist or the Antichrist. And there's many, right? To where it's like, you're going to have to either offer yourself. So when people don't speak up, right? Like Trump's aware of a lot of this shit. And he still chooses to do what he's doing because he can't change his character, or can he? Because another decision that you can make is, and this is the decision that most people need to make. Need to kind of wash my armpits because I'm starting to stink and get gross here. Well, anyway, I'll stay with it because that's what I'm doing, right? I'm walking, so I'm going into my past an hour and a half here, and that's great. Needed to. I was starting to put on just a lot of over compensation with where I couldn't rapidly take up any more glycogen into my liver or my that's why you see a lot of bloat with people, and they get this distension when they're eating a lot of carbohydrates, especially lifting at the same time, because your liver is going to, and your pancreas and all your organs are just like taking up, right, this energy, right? And on top of that, of course, your skeletal muscle, you're trying to keep that heightened state from the perspective of if I deplete in carbohydrates and then I carbohydrate load, I can store sometimes 200%, right? I think it even goes higher than this when you do these fasted non-carbohydrate protein only or protein fat, ketogenic or gluconeogenic adherence for long periods of time, and you really go into this, that your muscles just can take up, especially if they're really well trained and you're doing strength training. So that's what I'm going to be doing down the road that I played with for quite some time, where that picture that's on Rogue Beast Warrior was me having done that for several years, right? In fact, at least 3 or 4 years steady, with a lot of training. Of course, there's gaps. There's times where you need to take breaks, right? And there's times where you have to really listen to your body. And after that, I went into a real sort of almost vegan lifestyle that just made me broke. And that's why people go on the carnivore and find a lot of success on the carnivore, because eating high quality organic vegetables and getting in all the nutrients. I mean, I've gone over this over and over again. I've talked about this to length. I've even, done, you can look up where I'm looking at the monitor or the TV screen and discussing the correlation between and how much food you'd have to take in order to get the same nutritional value. Carnivore versus just straight veganism or vegetarianism, right? But we find that these diets and this dietary process is a statement to the ontology as well. Because I get into this and I talk about Cain and Abel, and I talk about there's a real dichotomy between the two. That whether or not these existed, this characterization of course, Cain would slay Abel because he was already slaying animals and processing animals. Of course, it wouldn't have been the other way around, right? And then you get into this long-standing argument of, well, you're killing plants. And the thing about it is that you're actually replanting the plants. And when the beauty with, and I'm by no means vegan or talking about veganism, and what will trip you out is that through this entire discourse, I also sort of capitulate back to the aspect that a transhumanism is unavoidable. Like 2001: A Space Odyssey and the monolith, when we really get into the study, well, I've got some nice bubbly water in here. Literally, it's called bubbly. It's on sale at, and this is a strawberry flavor. It actually has a really nice effervescence. So I appreciate this. Grateful. I'm grateful to people for tuning in, people now and in the future. This is a really tricky area because you studying Nietzsche and Heidegger going into depth with this and seeing how these people used the verbal skills and even tapped into, in an ontological sense, a sort of timeless language model that would best express, Dasein, right, with Heidegger, really the human suffering, the human experience as an entity, right? And really harkens into to Nietzsche's Overman, but first arrives at the unavoidable where we are now, where the statement, you must suffer, because this is the suffering that you're going through is like being buried under the World Trade Centers, the rubble, right? And maybe that's what that ritual was all about. I mean, it happened there in that same time span. Did you ever think about that? Did you ever think about that? That is the space odyssey, the monoliths, but this dual monolith, 11, right? 11 right out in front of you. The life and death, right? 11 is a very intriguing number, one beyond perfection. Going on to the next cycle, or is it the end? And so when you look at these generations, you see the 13 and the 23 reappear over and over again. In fact, I could count from Pfungstadt, Germany, up into my generation. I can count back 13 generations. I went into depth studying this using ChatGPT, and it was very interesting. Even sending letters off to Germany and getting a hold of information that verified and validated. The only thing that my family line can't verify and validate is that this goes back to the Crusades, the Roman Catholic crusades, the occupation of a Johann von Marstaller, where the name appears. And this goes way the fuck back. And then I even pushed it even further. And so what you had during that time frame, if that even existed, going back to like 1300s, the 1100s, right? Which is subjective, because there's a big growing influence that says anything prior to the 1300s, and it may even be further after, there's a 1,000-year gap. There's people who have evidence in support of this, they say. There's others that say this is ridiculous. Others say maybe it's 500 to 700 years that's sort of missing. But I would venture to say that if this is true, we have less gaps to fill in with family lineage, right? And between what was subjectively talked about as really the Knights Templar going on to the Knights of Malta, and so supposedly carrying certain items such as the Ark of the Covenant, stuff that Rudolf Steiner talks about, Golgotha, the spear that supposedly, there's all this subjectivity about Jesus, whether or not he existed, but there's more in support of Jesus, or from Ralph Ellis's work, King Isis, right? Actually being, having existed 30, 40 years, even 50 years after, post the said transition to AD, and that we're actually looking at a dejected king, right? From a dejected queen, the Mother Mary, right? And that the Romans, the Catholics, really were following a family line that was removed. And this happened before, right? You see the Queen of Scots. Look at John Dee and the cipher codes and all this. I mean, this shit's for real. This happened more than once. Or is that when it happened? Are these Arturian legends and these stories that seem to be... So Glenn Kimball, who just disappeared. Like, he spent this campaign going back like 10 plus years, going on coast to coast, talking about Melchizedek and Enoch and Jesus in the Americas, right? And all these other postulations, even opening his own college. And then all of a sudden, when he passes away, his daughter does not carry on his campaign. The entire operation's shut down. You'll be hard pressed to even like listen to any sort of interest in the area, the things that he discusses. Yet many of this is being discussed out in the open, in another position, obviously, but postulations between Ralph Ellis, a lot of conflict and conjecture here, Neil through Gnostic Informant, and Amon Hillman, right? Which I'll have to go back in and check out his channel. I'm not susceptible anymore, right, to this. But there was a time when I was, where I would say, oh, I'm not going to get drawn in by this. So I don't put people down who got drawn into this little trap where they see themselves as now full-fledged Satanists, right? But this kind of gets into what I was talking about a couple live streams back here today, which is I was talking about Jason 𝕯𝖒𝖕𝖊𝖗 and his discussion where he's point blank asked whether or not he's a Satanist by the recent interview with Jesse Michaels. By the way, if you're blown away by a lot of the things that Jason talked about, and that's your only exposure to Jason 𝕯𝖒𝖕𝖊𝖗, right? I'll tell you that if you look at his Substack and you go back even further and you look at many of his other interviews, you're going to be blown away by this guy's intellect. But at the same time, you're going to wonder when you start to look at these discrepancies and this disparaging detail, if the guy's not a complete and total bullshitter, right? And obviously, there's some bullshit involved with everything that is being confidently proselytized and supported by anyone who's on a soapbox, making their living by way of political interest, talking about specific subject matters, because there's a lot of fill-ins, right? I used to really like posting up and watching Cliff High for that reason, and then I found that he would go into these sort of God, what's the term that he likes to use? I'm kind of drawing a blank because I haven't eaten today. I'm spending a little time actually not eating, and then I'm going to go in and carb up a little later today. Prescient, right? So he gets into this prescient response where he's looking for information from the ontology, and then he's saying that he used this, thinking that he's using some clairvoyance, where in fact he's just an army brat with a silver spoon in his mouth, and he's just passed down the inheritance where he never really had to work hard a day in his life. And he would be the first person to rail back, point his finger in your face, as many baby boomers do, and call you full of bullshit. But in the same breath, he'd have to admit that he's actually considered a psychopath, right, and a schizophrenic, which he has said. So he's trying to show that his bad behavior has cause, and that his abusive way of being and putting himself above other people. When I finally saw this with Cliff High, I was like, there's no way I'm going to gaslight myself and pretend this guy isn't anything but a fucking opportunist. And he does actually state that he is in a particular recording that he does and posts up recently, just in the past few months. So there was no way that I could ever listen to him again, like where he's talking about this sort of clairvoyance, and that he has used this for his own advantage. And it's like, man, you wonder why you got so old and ugly, and why some witch, this Heidi, is taking advantage of you. And you're pretending that she's not, when in fact she definitely is. And that you've been crux, you've been jinxed by the witch. They're taking everything that you are. But you sort of look at this Merlin or this wizard depiction, and it's like, oh, you want to mancy and tickle the feminine. And so what 𝕯𝖒𝖕𝖈 is, and what debatably Amon Hillman and Jason Reza Georgiani are warlocks with a C at the end, without the K. The arcane, archaic, old world expression of that which follows the feminine ontology. So this is really the rites and rituals that get into Edward Kelly, and women have to look at themselves and go, oh, holy shit. Yeah, like for woman's plight, for womanhood, I have only survived. I am only here because at some point I had to poof up my breasts and make them look really good for a job interview. I had to use coyness and act suspiciously aloof and stupid so that I could actually get somebody to hire me. And I just sort of rode under the rails. I didn't try to be a stand-up star employee. I realized that if I bat my eyelashes, I do less, so I supplicated. And then you see what emerges later once they've done this, once they've taken the spoils, right? Is that a highly qualified man had his job taken from him. But the witch rails back. Are there any highly qualified men? It's like, from one perspective, these druids, which is what the Masons and the Illuminati and the Knights of Malta, there's an alliance, a balance, that go back to the Ophites and obviously back to Babylon and far before that. But in our modern day discourse of the last 33 to 3,700 years, this is the reset, right? The reinvention of man, what it's going to look like for the next 23 some odd generations, until it reaches a precipice, it reaches its high point at, say, like 34 generations, or even like 42 to 44, and shrinks back into itself, right? And that this ontological collection of numerology, geometria, the expression and the display is that nature, the true nature, has always been in charge, and that man is so flawed and faulty, but he can't get away from eating that synthetic steak, like in the Matrix, where it's like, I'll take the blue pill any day because this steak sure tastes good.